Alright, in this tutorial I'm going to show you the very basics of how to create a suspension system for like a vehicle in Blender. And where some people would do this with bones and, you know, essentially rigging like you would a character, I'm going to do it with rigid body constraints because that's the way I have learned it. Now, I'm not going to show you how to build a full suspension system because that would take a long time. What I'm going to do is just teach you the concept behind it and basically the simple way to create a spring effect that works with rigid bodies, and it's all dynamic and it uses constraints. And if you can understand how this works, then all it takes is some imagination and you can build a full functioning suspension system. Alright, and we're going to make this extremely simple, about the simplest way I know how to explain it. Alright, first thing I'm going to do is I'm in front side view right now. By pressing 1, I'm in front side view, and I also have an orthographic view. And to toggle in and out of orthographic view, you press 5. Alright, I'm going to bring this down so my my x-axis is right at the bottom. I'm only doing that so we have more space to work with, because I'm going to assume that this is ground level. Alright, I'm going to add a plane, and this plane will be like the ground. Alright, I'm just going to scale this up. It doesn't have to be any specific amount, it's just the ground. And since this will be a rigid body object, I'm going to apply the scale anytime I change the size of an object. So to apply the scale, I'm just going to press Control A. It brings up this menu, and then choose Scale. Alright, now I need to make this a rigid body object. So I'm going to, with the plane selected, come over here to the Physics tab, click Rigid Body, and then change it from active to passive. Alright, now we have a ground. Instead of using wheels and stuff like that, I'm just going to use blocks because we're only talking about the theory. Alright, I'm going to add mesh, and I'm going to choose cube. Now I'm going to work at this a little bit backwards from normal. Like if you was building a actual suspension, you would build the car up here and then you'd build the wheel down here. I'm going to build this as if it's kind of, well, I guess you could say it still would be the wheel to a degree. It looks a little different, but the theory is still the same. I'm just going to grab this on the z-axis, G to grab, Z for the z-axis, and then just bring it up here above the ground. Alright, now I'm going to turn this into a rigid body object as well. With that cube selected, I'm going to click rigid body, keep it set to active, and then set this to, let's say, about 100 kilograms. Now the weights, they're going to be specific for whatever project you're making. This is the weights that I'm adding, all the numbers and settings, that's going to be just for this project. The numbers that you're going to use are going to be specific for your project. Alright, but in this case I'm going to set it to 100. And I'm going to go ahead and stick this in wireframe so we can see inside of it, because we're going to need to see inside of it later. That way we can kind of see what we're doing a little bit better. Alright, I'm going to add another cube. And remember, this is going to be like the wheel, I guess you could say, except it's not going to roll, it's just going to have the spring effect. Alright, add mesh, and I'm going to add another cube. And then I'm going to grab this on the z-axis, G for grab, Z for the z-axis, and bring it up to top. Now I'm going to scale this by 2, alright? And move it up just a little bit more. Since I changed the size of it, Control A to apply the scale. Alright? This right here will be like the car, and this is going to be like the wheel. I need to make this a rigid body object also. So come over here to rigid body, and then I'm going to set this to about 10. Alright, now I need to, with one of these selected, then press shift and then select the other one, whether it's left click or right click for however you have Blender set up, but either way you need to have both of them selected, or you could just press B for box select and select both of them that way. And you need to come up here to object, come down here to rigid body, and then choose connect. Now when we're dealing with springs and rigid body constraints, the springs that we're gonna actually have this translate on the, or be a spring on the x-axis. So what we need to do, we need to rotate this constraint so the x is pointing straight up. Rotate x, pardon me, not x, rotate y, and then 90. Now it's pointing straight down, so we know we need to flip it 180 degrees, right? Rotate y 180. Now we have the x pointing straight up and down. Alright, since this is going to be like the spring, we're going to attach this spring to the wheel. So how we're going to do that, I'm going to select this cube and I'm going to press Shift S and then choose cursor to selection. And essentially all that does is put the cursor in the center of mass of this wheel. Alright. Now I'm going to select this rigid body constraint and I'm going to press Shift S and then choose selection to cursor. And then it essentially just puts the, it moves the constraint to this cursor location, which happens to be in the center of mass of this wheel or this cube. Now with this rigid body constraint selected, we're going to press Shift and then select on the cube and then press Control P, and then set parent to object. Basically we are parenting this constraint to this cube. That way no matter where we move this cube, the constraint moves with it. Alright. Now, what we need to do, we need to change some settings on this constraint. Because whenever the constraint is first created, it defaults to fixed. We don't want a fixed constraint. We want a generic spring. Alright. Now, a lot of these settings, I always use generic spring because you have all these different settings. Now for this example, we're not going to use all these settings. We're going to basically, on these limits right here, on the angles, just go ahead and tick all of them and then change every one to 0. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And the reason why we're doing that is because we don't want whatever's attached to this constraint to be able to rotate on the Y, X, or Z axis, just like it would be on a suspension system for the most part. Although there is, in reality, there is a little bit of rotation. Alright, now the linear, we need to set a limit. Now I'm just going to keep the x-axis set to -1 and +1. And essentially that's saying that this cube can move this cube that's attached to this constraint can move up 1 meter and down 1 meter. So you got basically 2 meters of travel, right? And then on the y-axis, I don't want it to move at all, so I'm going to press 0. On the z-axis, I don't want it to move at all. Z or 0. Alright. Now, we need to come down here, and this is the dampening or stiffness for the angle. Now, we don't need to set this because we already have it to 0 movement anyway. So we can ignore that little section and just come down here to the linear. Now, the only one we're messing with is the x-axis, going up and down like this. So we need to tick that one and leave the rest of them alone. Now right now it's set to the stiffness of 10 and the dampening of 0.5. Now I'm going to set my in-frame count to 100, and if I just press play, you see what happened? It falls down, it completely compresses the spring, and then it bottoms out. Now let's increase the stiffness. Let's set it to 100. Still not stiff enough, so let's set it to 1000. See, now we got some spring action going on, but it continues to bounce because we don't have enough dampening. So let's increase the dampening. Let's set this to 5. See, it's slowing down a little bit, but not quite enough. Let's set it to 20. So it looks more spring-like how it would be on a car, but still got a little bit too much bounce to it. Alright, so let's turn this up to, let's say, 40. Now that looks more realistic. Alright, now let's see what happens when we increase the weight on this. Now, right now it's set to 10 kilograms. Let's double the weight. Let's double the weight to 20 kilograms. See, the spring's acting a little bit different. Let's double it again to 40. It should bottom out. See, it bottomed out this time. Which means if we don't want it to bottom out, we need to go back to the constraint and give it more stiffness. Let's say set it to 2000. Still bottoming out a little bit. Let's set it to 3000. Not bottoming out, but now it's springy again. Needs more dampening. Let's go up to 100 on the dampening. See? It's all a relationship between the mass, the stiffness, and the dampening. Now let me turn the dampening up to something like 1000. See, that's too high. It completely dampens out every bit of it. Let's bring it down to 500. Still too much dampening. 250. That's kinda still too much, but you can see what it's doing. It compresses the spring a little bit, and then it bounces up, and then it pretty much stops. Let's set this to 150. And that actually looks pretty good. And of course, you can actually do this setting on any axis you want. Like, for an example, let me go back to the beginning, and I could actually rotate this, rotate Y 90, and then do it all on the Z axis, which in some ways it would make more sense. It's just whenever I learned how to do this, I always rotated it to the X axis going up and down. I forgot why I done that, but that's how I got it in my head. That's how I kind of programmed my line of thinking. Although in a lot of ways, it actually makes more sense if you have the Z axis going up, because that is the Z axis. So, just for an example, let's change this. Let's go all the way up here. On the angle, let's see, we'll keep all these the same because we're not looking for any rotation. But we'll change this on the x-axis to 0. And then on the z, we'll put -1 and 1. Alright. Then we'll come down here to the linear stiffness and dampening, we'll uncheck the x-axis and turn on the z-axis, and we'll set this to 3000 and then 150. And if we've done it correctly, it should act exactly the same way as it did before. It's just working on the z-axis of the constraint instead. See? Simple enough. And the way you build on this to build a full suspension system, like I said, this right here, this cube you would treat as the car. This cube you would treat as a hub, and that's the part that the wheel actually mounts to. And you would actually put another constraint that's parented to this cube, and that cube or that constraint would be like a rotation or a motor constraint. Because if you select this constraint, you can have this on a motor constraint. So I could literally press, with this constraint selected, press Shift D to duplicate. Alright, and then this constraint right here, I'm going to rename this motor. Alright, and then that constraint will actually be connected to a wheel, but instead of it being a generic spring, it's going to be a motor. Now the motors, they rotate, the motor rotates on the x-axis, so it's going to go around like this, around the x-axis. So if I was to add mesh and then cylinder and rotate Y 90, scale X, grab X, and then take this right here, this motor constraint, and let's see, which cube was this? That's the first cube. Alright, take the motor constraint and change it, get rid of this connection, and then add the wheel instead of it. And that essentially would be your wheel, if that makes any sense. Scale, whoops, wrong one. Scale, and that would be the wheel. Of course, it's not going to work quite right now, but that's essentially the very basics of how you do it. And all it takes is a little imagination and a lot of trial and error, and you can go from this to a full suspension system. And like on let's see, let me find my, I'm working on the other screen right now. Let me get this over here. Alright. Like this right here, this truck was built almost identical to how I done the constraint system in this tutorial. The only difference is it's a little bit more complicated. This is a much more simpler version, but this is essentially the same process. I just have, you know, actual wheels and stuff on it, but the theory and the process is exactly the same. Well, I wouldn't say exactly the same. It's the same. You just got to use your imagination to adapt it to something like this. But anyway, I hope you found that useful. And if you have a specific question, let me know in the comments and I will try to explain it. Eventually, I would like to get to the point where I have enough time to actually go through and make a proper tutorial explaining in detail how to create a full suspension system. But it will take a while to be able to do that because it's not it's kind of complicated, especially whenever you get to create, where, let me find that one. It's kind of old, I think. Let me. Like on this one, you know, the process of the tutorial I just showed is very similar to this. The only difference is the actual upper cube is like this frame. The lower cube is this axle. And what makes it more complicated on this is because these four links. Now the four links are not actually doing anything. They're just there. Now the constraints, which I have set up here, in a later version I'm using hinge constraints, which meant it's rotating along the z-axis. Here I'm using point constraints, but in the more refined version I'm using hinge constraints. And the only thing those constraints are doing is holding these four links in place. The four links aren't actually doing anything. They're just there for looks. The actual suspension is being controlled by this constraint. And this constraint is basically doing the same thing between this axle and this frame piece as what you see here in this tutorial. And the only difference with the wheel connected to the axle, essentially this whole piece is like the lower cube on that tutorial, and the wheel obviously would be out here. Like in this piece I don't actually have the wheels attached or the motor constraints set up yet. I was just getting the suspension working correctly. But as complicated as this may look, it's no more complicated than that tutorial I just showed you. If you can figure that out, you can do this. Just a little imagination. But anyway, I've rambled on a little bit too long as it is. I got so much stuff I got to do. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I will try to answer your question. Guess that's it. Later, people.